I wanted to talk today about this book, Queer Data by Kevin Guyan, using gender, sex, and sexuality data for action. So when Kevin Guyan is talking about queer data, he's talking about two main things. First of all, the inclusion of LGBTQ plus identities within data and research, but he's also talking about how we can queer methods, processes. So let's jump into the book and see what information he can provide for us as we consider conducting qualitative research with LGBTQ plus populations. So in the intro called Introduction, Data, and Difference, he introduces us to his two different trajectories of what he means by queer data. And so first of all, he says queer data is more than the study of individuals that sit outside of the category of heterosexual or cisgender. It is equally a brash, confrontational, and in-your-face challenge to conventional understandings of how data and identity intersect. Is this data going to be used to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people? So he's stating that not only do you collect data, but what is the point of the collection of this data? What is it going to do in the material world? On page 2, he's also pointing out that collecting data and revealing LGBTQ plus identities is not always a positive, and of course there's power in being hidden, in being uncounted. So this book was published in 2022, and so this is right after the UK does their first census that includes the LGBTQ identity marker. And so globally, LGBTQ is not included in most countries' censuses, and so this data and information is really unknown, and often it's collected by LGBTQ-oriented organizations and nonprofits globally. With the census including these categories, then, this group of people will become visible, so that can provide some positive outcomes, such as knowing the number of the population, the diversity of the population, but it can also cause negative outcomes as well. It can flatten the diversity of experiences into small categories, and it will always undercount the number of people as well. And so that might do a disservice to the community because the government will count fewer people than the reality and therefore allocate fewer fundings to that particular community. And so he's also stating in this introduction that, of course, this is a critical book. He's also positioning the book Queer Data within the frameworks of feminist, post-colonial, and critical race scholarship and applying that to the LGBTQ plus intersecting identities. So he points out historically that this category has not been counted in a large-scale way, such as the census, and that when it was counted, it was in a very dehumanizing and stigmatizing manner. And so for the UK current efforts to count this population, they are trying to gather this data because the 2010 Equality Act requires the gathering of such information for public institutions. And so he's saying that if this data is going to be collected, that it should be done by and for the LGBTQ community, and that they should have control over how the data is collected and how the data is used. So he says, since August 2019, a private polling company called YouGov had tracked the responses from a sample of just under 2,000 UK adults to ask the question about sexual identity. And this is where the previous data had come from, since the census has not previously included this information. And so this is from a poll of 2,000 people to represent the entire population, and they were estimating that about 1% of the UK population was LGBTQ+. Because he's also talking about the dangers of these categories in that they can flatten a diverse representation, and also that they could become ahistorical and lack the social context of these categories that take place in a particular cultural context and a particular time period, geographic region, that they are shifting over time, and they might mean different things to different people. He talks about some of the types of information that have already been collected. A lot of the information is based on experiences of discrimination, poor treatment, and so it is important to capture this types of data, and he talks about what data is, that when you file a police report, that is creating a data point, but that also runs the risk of creating very negative data and reinforces the stereotypical idea that LGBTQ people are unduly facing extreme hardships, instead of also just balancing that information out with, positive aspects of life as well. And so the particular orientation of the institution is going to direct what kinds of materials is collected, but the data is going to be collected in response to what that particular organization does and what it wants to address. He's also making the distinction within this introduction that data is not reality. Data is a record of the social world mediating through decisions made about what or whom to include or exclude. So he's making the point that data is not reality, but data reflects the decisions made in how to go about capturing that data, creating the categories to capture that data, how it's analyzed, and how it's presented in society in order to affect change. So the book is divided into 3 parts, and this first part is about collecting queer data. So the first chapter is called Gaps and Absences, A History of Queer Data. He situates this chapter in historical research in the early 20th century Britain. And so basically he's asking, what archival information or research was there on LGBT folks in the early 20th century in Britain? And so therefore, this is a great start to begin our journey into queer data, of thinking about how this type of information would have been documented over 100 years ago. And so of course he's pointing out that, the concept of LGBTQ now is very different than it would have shown up in early 20th century Britain. LGBT folks weren't counted on the census. So the information that he does find, for example, the first one came out of an organization called the Albany Trust, a gay rights organization established in the 1950s that was, among other things, looking to document their population. And so this was a social needs survey, so it was about general well-being. People stated that they felt well-adjusted in their sexuality. He's stating that a lot of data that's collected is within the established organizations. And so he states that the data sources investigated mainly relate to legal, medical, and scientific practices, which reflect the interests of those who have the power to survey, categorize, and implement actions to control the behavior of others. So it goes back to his first idea and question of why is data collected to begin with. Here he points to power. Power to survey, power to categorize, power to implement actions. And so of course those orientations are going to be from justifying the institution itself. And so even in his example of the Albany Trust, then, this organization is also trying to legitimize itself, say that there is a community of people out there that need our services, including collection of such data. He also points to other kinds of data that might represent this time period. For example, letters, poetry, art, things that are qualitative and personal and could have been preserved within families. But also it's going to be from people that are, wealthier, white. And so he's saying that what he wants to do in this chapter is not only tell a story of historical LGBTQ people and populations, but also just pair that with the history of the collection methods that were used to gather this information, and just to point out to us, with our sociological imagination, that should always be what we're thinking about when we gather new information, when we learn new information, is how was this information gathered. He also talks about the direct connection between collecting statistics and information and the relationship to eugenics. And so, so this points to his kind of idea that collecting data isn't always a total good. Like, once you make populations visible, then it could also have negative repercussions. For example, if the state has a eugenics orientation, or if we're thinking about, in the United States with mental health and disability, identifying those kinds of populations could also put them in danger. And also how he talks about the role of the modern homosexual as a moral panic, as something to be concerned about, and so therefore something to be identified, isolated, and managed. So the next section is called Counting the Homosexual, and he jumps then to the Second World War. And he's saying that after World War II, that there was a lot of movement within academic worlds and the government to just kind of document everyday life of its citizens. And at the same time, within the world of academia, within the world of social science and psychology, within the world of medicine, this early attention to homosexuality, especially among men. Schofield conducted hundreds of one-on-one interviews with homosexual men and presenting findings in publications including Society and the Homosexual, 1952, and that the government in 1954 had organized a committee to explore the issues of homosexuality and prostitution. So therefore, just this government attention to these now defined as social problems. But the committee did publish a report in 1957 that recommended the decriminalization of sex between men aged 21 and over. And then, of course, we've now gotten into the 60s, and so he mentions queer academic and activists from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s onwards begin to organize themselves and conduct research on their own population and from their own population. And so therefore we start to get into different factions of the community, different power struggles, different ideas on categorizations and so on. And then he mentioned, of course, with the internet, that really changed everything about data collection. It created new spaces for LGBTQ individuals to meet each other. And now he's already getting into the year 2007, where the UK government oversaw compliance with equality legislation and organized an office called the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So now governments are actually trying to instill rights for all people, including LGBTQ folks and others under a Human Rights Commission. And so this first chapter then is providing a very quick overview of 100 years of research, but based on just maybe 5 different kinds of types of examples of data. But just to show that we have to think about how data, how current concepts would be, of course, very differently categorized 100 years plus, and also how biased certain kinds of information could be if we're only looking at diaries and letters versus we're only looking at hospital records or prison intake forms, for example. The chapter is called Gaps and Absences, and so it's really about this kind of creative putting together of various puzzle pieces that were available during that time period, and also just shedding light on our abilities to really create in-depth research nowadays. Chapter 2 is called Moving Targets, Queer Collection Methods. So in this chapter, he opens with 2 different stories of one filing a police report against a transphobic graffiti, and also filing a complaint within the university about how it had violated its own diversity policies. And so he's saying that by creating these complaints, that is creating data. And even though he knows that this data is probably not going to do very much in itself, that it's creating a record, it's creating a record that something is wrong. And so the collection together of ongoing similar reports filed by other people, and if these things start to add up, then they can point to an issue that should be addressed. He then states that this chapter's focus on queerness as method therefore asks, in moments when data is captured, whose interests are prioritized? And so when we think about moving targets, he's also stating that before LGBTQ identities were presented within any kind of surveys or census or findings, it's not like they were a stable identity that we're just waiting to be discovered, he states, but that both identities and the ways in which we collect methods are both moving targets and have challenges within each one. And so he's saying that problems are now going to emerge when researchers, institutions, I'll add, and participants agree over the existence of problems. So he has a section called Data Collection Methods, and he points out that often the focus is so much on findings, and in this chapter he's also specifically focusing on surveys, interviews, and focus groups. But he's saying that we usually obscure and don't pay attention to the ways in which data was collected and how that actually shapes the data that is collected. And not only, of course, initially collected, for example, the categories that are going to be used, the questions that are going to be asked, whose perspective is embedded within the instrument of collection. He uses an example of a survey of 227 adults and asks if their sexual identity had changed between when they were a teenager and the present day. And so over 4/5, or 83%, did report a change to their sexual identity or how they understood themselves. So therefore, the research tools can include ways in which the participants can update their information and reaffirm that they still identify in the same ways. He's pointing out that identity characteristics are moving targets. And he's also saying in this chapter that there is a relationship between the participants and the data collection, and that the data collection and research process is dependent upon this relationship as well. So he uses the example of Britain's National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles. And so he was talking about creative ways in which researchers then suggested perhaps to invert the assumed norm identity embedded within the question or the identity category. For example, instead of asking if people are straight or heterosexual, to ask if they are gay or not gay. So flipping the normative assumption that doesn't really provide a great outcome either. He's also talking about how other researchers recommend using a scale. For example, instead of asking someone their gender identity, ask them on a scale or a range of 1 to 10. You could put masculinity and femininity. And so that would provide a lot more granular insights. And so it's just to make the point that if you change the question itself, change the category, if you invert the category, if you define the category in a radically new way, then of course you're going to reveal different kinds of information. He points out that the participants and the organization, the researchers, have different aims and objectives and incentives within the research. And so ultimately, is the research going to uphold the rights of the participants or of the institution? For example, filing reports against police brutality, that would be perhaps filing a complaint within the police institution itself. And so therefore the institution itself would be motivated to discount these types of reports. And so it's really important to understand, the context in which data is collected and who owns that, and how it could be used, and how the participants within that data collection might be at odds with the institutional organization collecting that information. And so he has a section called Queer Data Ethics, which really talk about the outcomes of this kind of research, especially when the organization and the participants might be at odds with the outcomes. So for example, he positions these two different questions. How can we change the institution to make it more equitable, versus what data will present the institution in a positive light? So he states later on page 62 that therefore this puts an onus on the researcher to do something meaningful with the data collected. So when he says do something meaningful, he's implying meaningful for the participant, because perhaps for the organization, in order to collect this information, to make the participants feel heard, and then to shelve it and do nothing, which could perhaps the participants were challenging the organization. So therefore action based on this research would therefore challenge the position of the organization. And so why would they pay to have this research done that accuses their own organization of wrongdoing? Right? So we have to understand the power behind the data collection, analysis, and outcomes. And so here he's concluding this chapter with a major assumption. He says the collection of data about LGBTQ people involves an ethical obligation to ensure data collected is used to meaningfully impact the lives about whom the data reflects. So this chapter is really kind of pointing out the tensions that can exist between the organization and the participants, and just this embedded assumption on his part that the ethical obligation is towards the participants and creating a meaningful change using this data. Chapter 3 is called Queer the Census, Sex, Sexual Orientation, and Trans Questions in Scotland's Census. So this chapter is based solely on the UK Census and its attempt to be inclusive for the first time of sexual orientation and in Scotland of trans identity. So the author points out that in the UK, 3 separate censuses take place every 10 years in England and Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So there's a whole science for surveys and censuses about questions, question stems, what order the answers are, how the question itself is framed, what question comes before and after it, how the sequence of questions or the sequence of answers could alter the effect of a person continuing with the survey or even answering the next question. They might get offended, for example. So the government commissioned 2 research companies to test whether a non-binary sex question would affect how people completed the census and any impact on response rates. And you can imagine also behind the scenes of such changes, there's a lot of different kinds of rights organizations that might be advocating for a particular outcome. So lots of LGBTQ groups might be advocating for the inclusion of a particular type of question and how it's phrased. And he points out that this issue even went to the High Court. So basically he's saying that a lot goes into something as simple as adding a few questions to the census to attempt to capture a demographics of the population that has previously gone uncaptured. And so all the politics, all the rights organizations that are advocating for inclusion, all of the government responses, all of the court decisions that affect the outcomes of what can be included on the census, how it's stated, the order it's stated in, the answers that are provided, ultimately the point of the collection of this data and what the outcomes are for. If we look at how recent this is, like this is happening right now, pretty much every country does not count trans identity, and many states have only begun to ask sexual orientation questions. For example, in the United States, previously years ago, they tried to ask a voluntary question about whether someone is involved in a same-sex relationship. And so, of course, you can see from the framing of that particular question that it excludes lots of people. If someone's single, if someone's bisexual and involved in a, opposite sex relationship, and so on. So asking about someone's relationship status versus if they're in a same-sex marriage, for example, that's a higher status, or about one's sexual orientation, and then how you present the options, boxes to check, a gradient, all of these different answers and will provide different outcomes that can be used in different ways. So just every single aspect of how data is collected is significant, and this really sheds light on one particular example of the census, which is a tool that's trying to count actually every citizen in the nation. Chapter 4 is called Beyond Borders, Queer Data Around the World. And so now we look globally to the capture of LGBTQ data within censuses and surveys, and just the national context and how that will affect data collection. And he states that the OECD in 2019 reported that just 15 of their 36 member countries had conducted at least one nationally representative survey that asked respondents to self-identify their sexual orientation, and only the United States, Chile, and Denmark had collected nationally representative data about trans and gender identity. In some countries, it's just going to be downright dangerous to capture this information. And so he talked about how the Chechen Republic in Russia is regarded as one of the most dangerous places in the world for LGBTQ people. He points out that in some countries, LGBTQ people continue to be targeted, to be murdered at high rates, and to face a lot of violence, not only from other individuals, but state-sanctioned violence as well. And so there's going to be a very uneven collection of this data, and even agreement or consideration of collecting this data at the national level. He also talks about how in many countries the legal process for changing gender or sex information on a birth certificate is difficult, if not impossible. Some countries, he mentioned, have introduced an X marker for gender so that people can be categorized as male, female, or X. As of 2022, passports for international travel are required to include a gender marker, but people might be impacted when they use their passport and are traveling to another country that doesn't accept that type of categorization. In this chapter, he breaks it down by global region, and so he has a section on Latin America and the Caribbean, and talks about high rates of hate crimes and violence. But many Latin American countries do have systems in place to collect data about the identity characteristics of LGBTI victims. He has a section on Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Kenya that offer third gender categories. 2011, Nepal became the first country to conduct a census that allowed respondents to identify as a third gender. In India, they had 3 options for a sex question in the 2011 census. Pakistan's 2017 census also counted trans people, although quite an undercount. And that other countries forego national censuses for relying on particular institutions to capture data of their citizens. And so this chapter is just examining the issue on a global level, and so just the inequalities of the different countries and their approaches and levels of acceptance or violence towards LGBTQ people are going to impact the data that's collected at a national level, or the data that is projected onto the national level. So those 4 chapters just are part of part 1 that talk about collecting queer data. So part 2 of this book is called Analyzing Queer Data, and it includes 2 chapters. And so chapter 5 is called Straightwashing, the cleaning and analysis of queer data. So these 2 chapters are about cleaning data, and he says, first of all, the concept of cleaning data implies that something is dirty about it, is something that's wrong about it. And so cleaning data means, for example, if someone starts to answer a survey and they don't complete it, then those incomplete surveys are thrown out. He's arguing that one way in which people might queer data is to answer a question which does exclude LGBTQ people, but they answer it in a way to try to be included. For example, if someone was asked if they're married and they're in a same-sex relationship and same-sex marriages are not legal, but they said yes, they're married, then that's one way for the participant to kind of queer the data to try to attempt to be included in the data. However, at this stage of the data cleaning process, if those kinds of answers are discovered, they might be excluded. He says in the U.S. Census, in the 1990 census, for example, if 2 male respondents in the same household described their relationship as husband-wife, then the Census Bureau would leave the relationship intact as a married relationship, but go back and change the sex of one of the people to male or female so that it's now an opposite sex relationship. He's using the term straightwashing to talk about how queer data that is attempting to be included when it's not in the list of options is the idea of straightwashing. You're taking out the wrong answers, the queer answers, any kind of queer populations that were included or were attempting to be included in the data could now be stripped at this point of the data analysis. He says this is especially erasing of the experiences of bisexual people, especially when sexual orientation is reduced to one's current relationship status of same-sex or opposite-sex coupling, that bisexual people can really be marginalized at this point, especially if they're in an opposite-sex relationship. And he's saying that this might be parallel to racial and ethnic categories, especially categories that want people to check only one race. And so that for people that cut across different boxes and categories, mixed race people, they present a challenge to the current labels used, and so therefore that challenges the census or the survey to alter their categories or to include these folks in a different way. For example, saying check all that apply, or multiple race, and so on. And so he has a section called small numbers, and he's basically saying that any kind of data collection agency, survey, census, when they encounter a demographic that is less than 1% of the population, they're really adverse to even addressing this kind of inclusion, because these very small numbers, any small differences within that very small group can affect the statistics and outcomes of the count of those demographics. When you're looking at national statistics or censuses and so on, big data, they'd rather just kind of exclude and drop those groups. Chapter 6 is called Queer Validation, Data Practices and the Recognition of LGBTQ Identity Claims. So in this chapter, he opens by going back to the Scotland census and their questions on trans identity and trans history, and talks about how the question came to be worded. And so he's making the point that the wording of the question has to actually reflect the social world and reality of the participants. They have to choose that category. And so we can think about different categories that come from the community, how people self-identify with their particular tribe or specific local identity versus categories imposed upon them by the government. For example, in the United States, Hispanic is a category created by the government, but Chicana might be a term, or Tejana, that comes from the community and is not going to be found on a particular government form. So he states on page 133, this chapter examines practices that determine the validity of data which occur during and after the collection of data, and informed by biases and assumptions as to whether data is representative of the social world. So just matching that up, like you created the data collection tool, the questionnaire, and so on, and how does that really match up with the people that, the participants that did answer the survey, and now is the data valid at the analysis point? And he's saying it's a very recent phenomenon that people have a so-called identity, and that this identity is understood by others, he's saying, is a relatively recent and culturally specific phenomenon. And he points out, like in Brazil, Brazilian race boards, which would provide experts that could overrule how individuals self-identify racially. And even in the United States Census, historically, sometimes if people check the wrong race box, that could be overruled by the person administering the census. So just the violence that goes into reducing the person into the form. And again, just the different assumptions that underpin the design, not only of survey methods and censuses, but now he mentions also airport body scanners, which have a cis-normative assumption, he says, that underpins the design of the machine itself, and that the operator has to put man or woman when the person goes into the airport scanner, and therefore if they have bodily abnormalities, then the machine will flag that. And so that's obviously a situation that could really disadvantage trans folks who are traveling. And so this part 2 section has really just been about the point of the cleaning, the data analysis part, the cleaning of the data, and how at this point the real life experiences of the people has been captured in the data, but now it could be stripped from the data because it didn't fit precisely into the boxes and categories, and especially that gap between self-identification and how identities are framed in the official government forms. And so now we turn to part 3, which is called using queer data. And so chapter 7 we turn to next. It's called Loud Voices Communicating Queer Data in Online Spaces. So in this chapter, he states that he's going to discuss past work on insider-outsider research and the tricky question of whether someone must self-identify as LGBTQ to make decisions about queer data. For LGBTQ people to change data practices that impact LGBTQ lives, they must appeal to cis heterosexual gatekeepers. Whatever systems and organizations, government offices that are collecting data necessarily entail that cis heterosexual gatekeepers are the ones that have power over the collection, the analysis, and the application of such data. And he's saying that data is an embodied practice because data does not speak for itself. Others speak on behalf of data. So there's always people involved in every aspect of data, including speaking on behalf of data. So that is the point of this chapter, is analyzing, does a person have to be LGBTQ identified in order to work with queer data? That's assuming some kind of identity that is not going to be in disagreement with each other, which of course we know you can't have any person or group of people representing LGBTQ identities that everyone is going to agree with, and that there is lots of disagreement within any community. And so basically there's pros and cons to being so-called insider, so-called outsider, but ultimately people can learn enough about the community, the power imbalances, the data collection, analysis, and implementation to be conscientious. And he's saying being complicit is when your identity characteristics enable you to benefit from an unequal structure and your related participation in perpetuating that unequal structure. He's also saying that as a so-called insider, one's self-identity as a researcher, say, can be different from how one is perceived by the participant or by an outsider. And so, for example, for LGBTQ people, some might be more visibly out or stereotypically visible. He's also showing that within LGBTQ organizations, there's a certain hierarchy of those who have more power, more wealth, more status, and who are able to control the narrative. So he's saying that within this chapter, he's explored the limitations of insider-outsider approaches, the privilege of out researchers, and the potential gap between how researchers self-identify and how they're perceived by their participants. So chapter 8 is the last content chapter. It's called Fight Back, Using Queer Data for Action. So throughout the book, he's said that ultimately the purpose of collecting data and analyzing data about queer people should have outcomes that are beneficial to queer people's actual lives and daily existence. So he's pointing out that the world of politics and policy making runs on data, and that LGBTQ rights organizations are required to engage with existing systems of powers and ways of working to bring about change. But without data, social problems are not visible, and therefore they can't have solutions. And so he's providing in this final chapter some examples about how data about LGBTQ communities can play a role in provisions of, for example, healthcare and housing. He talks about an abolitionist approach to data practices, for example, not collecting this particular data, considering the outcomes of what does the collection of that data actually do in the long run. The conclusion of his book is called Who Counts? So he starts the conclusion with an overview of the book and the different parts in each chapter and how it's contributed to the totality of his argument. And he has a section called Where Do We Go From Here? And he mentions that he wrote Queer Data during the COVID-19 global pandemic, and how this brought into sharp focus the relationship between data, people's identity characteristics, and government responses. And so we have the perspective of the entire globe and all the ways in which different countries reacted to the pandemic, and also how they surveilled their populations. And so he says, while writing Queer Data, it became clear to me that the book does not go far enough in examining what lies beyond normative ideas about data. Something that has occurred to me throughout this book is just considering the history of data collection and how all these methods, quantitative and qualitative methods, have been established over long periods of time, but how current identity categories, for example, are way ahead of the categories that are included on the forms, or even just the social realities of people and how quickly that changes, whereas the data collection processes and tools and implementations are much slower and much further behind the actual lived experiences of the participants. And so in the conclusion of this conclusion, he presents 8 queer questions for those engaged in the collection, analysis, and use of gender, sex, and sexuality data to bring to their work. And so these are 8 questions which, ask like the purpose of your research, do they present an authentic account of LGBTQ lives, who's it going to impact, who is involved in the decision-making processes, and so on. Just basically an ethical account of the entire perspective of data collection, analysis, and implementation of any outcomes and policies and so on. By looking at the examples that he provides in his book, we can understand how to consider going about our own research when we want to include LGBTQ populations in our research, or just critique the data collective methods and processes in which we engage. So I would love to hear if you've read this book or if you're currently conducting research on this population and how you're going about it. Or if you're doing other research, just how you go about your ethical considerations and balancing the privacy, the rights of your participants, and the outcomes, and analyzing if the outcomes of that research really give back to the community that has helped you collect this data. So thank you, and I appreciate you hanging in there for this overview of this book.